This is my telephone as of 1995. As you can see, it is a telephone with buttons, and this is the speaker button, and also this would be the caller ID. Caller ID is attached to the telephone, to the outlet for the electrical outlet, and this one is for the caller ID itself. The name and number would be displayed here on the screen, and there are 4 buttons, and the buttons would be for to listen to the messages, to go back and forth buttons on the messages, and a redial button for a call. The caller ID is from US West. It's also from the 1995. And the telephone itself has the electrical outlet that would be plugged in for the phone, and it has it has a green cord that would be plugged into the telephone jack, and as you can see, it is also plugged into the caller ID itself. And the other cord is to be plugged into the telephone. The telephone was my best telephone that I used quite often. My only telephone exactly for the 1990s, and this was the only model that they had. There were no cell phones at this time, and they were just beginning to arrive, and people were purchasing cell phones, but I still preferred my older model phone because this was my best phone. And as I mentioned, the caller ID, there wasn't anything attached to the telephone itself. It was a separate unit here that I had to purchase along with the telephone. And I enjoyed this type of telephone because I want to say that I am old school, and I wasn't very I would say I was concerned about using a cell phone because I had heard that cell phones were going to be purchased and were being purchased, but I wasn't interested in cell phones because I was concerned about how to use a cell phone, if I would be able to understand how to use one, being, as I mentioned before, an old school person. And I thought, well, I will continue to use my old phone here until I try a cell phone and see if I felt comfortable with one, or I would continue to use my landline phone. This is the older landline model. It's not the newer landline model that you can purchase today. And I continue to use my telephone here and my caller ID because this is what I felt comfortable with. But as of now, I have to admit, I do have a cell phone. I feel very comfortable using my cell phone, and I no longer use this telephone. And if I did purchase a landline, which I did, I would say approximately 3 years ago, but I did not use it. I ended up giving it to a friend because they did not have a telephone at all. And I did purchase the newer model of the telephone, which was a landline, and after giving it to a friend, I did have to read the directions because my friend wasn't uh, comfortable with either a cell phone or a landline phone. He had been using a telephone that had a rotor on it. When I say rotor, I do not mean the push buttons here, but you can push the buttons. He had been using a phone where you have the numbers, but it was a dial, and you have to dial the numbers and dial the numbers. If you wanted a 1, there was a 1, you have to dial it. So he was accustomed to the dial, the rotary type of telephone. When I purchased the telephone for myself and gave it to my friend, I had to read, excuse me, I had to read the directions, and I had to explain it to him how to actually use the landline telephones that are now being purchased. But I did keep my older model telephone, as you can see here, and my caller ID, because as I mentioned before, it was my telephone for many years and my best telephone that I had. Even when I had other push button telephones, I still preferred this one over the other ones. And as you can see, this is a US West model, and those were the ones that were available with the telephones here that I had purchased. Also, I wanted to show you something else. Along with the telephone, I had purchased something that I would use rarely, and that was before, if you can see it here, I will move it up to the camera here where you can possibly see it, excuse me, for the delay here. This is AT&T recorder. An AT&T recorder, it does not, as you can see, it does not have a caller ID. This was connected to the telephone for messages only. And I preferred not to use the AT&T recorder with messages only, and I preferred to use my US West caller ID, where I can actually see the name and number displayed on the screen. I just wanted to show you my old telephone, and also I wanted to explain to you that this was my best telephone, but as you can see here from the wires, there were a lot of wires compared to a cell phone today. And after using a cell phone and becoming comfortable with a cell phone, I decided I would no longer use my telephone any longer and my caller ID. When I realized that the telephone number would be displayed and the person's name would be displayed on the screen, I no longer had to have two different devices, a telephone and a caller ID device with the name displayed on the screen. And I no longer had to have all of the cords that I used for my phone and for my caller ID. Along with, or bring it back again and show you, along with the messenger. So I decided that all of these devices, I would prefer to use a cell phone, and I do not wish to use a landline any longer. I have a cell phone and I'm very comfortable with it, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, and I just wanted to show you the telephone that I did use for many years in the 90s.